All right. Can you hear me? Yes. Excellent. Good start. All right. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Sarah and to Luke for helping get set up, and thank you to Wellesley for welcoming me back. I am very, very excited to be here. And do you know who's even more excited that I am here? My wife and my kids, because they are so tired of hearing about the Battle of Bunker Hill, and I just love talking about the Battle of Bunker Hill. So, often in my house, I'll be reading something, and my wife will be minding her own business, and I'll start a sentence with, and she knows that some boring history thing is coming next. And she goes, what is it? And my kids they're little kids, they're 6 and 9 years old, but now if I approach a plaque in person, the littlest one holds my hand and goes, "No, Daddy, no," because he knows I'll just get sucked in for 20 minutes going, "Oh, look at this," and then on this date. Anyway, so I'm so thrilled to be here to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is the Battle of Bunker Hill. I love this battle, not because I like war or violence or anything like that. I am fascinated by this story. First of all, it happened in our home turf. The revolution took place all up and down the eastern seaboard and the Caribbean and, everywhere. But this battle happened on a place where you can walk today, And so if you walk around Charlestown, it's charming and, quaint, and the streets are so narrow. And you can really feel that this battle happened in that town, even today when you walk there. The other thing is, this battle was not supposed to happen and did not need to happen. And the reason it happened is because of the personalities of the players involved, both on the British side and on the American side. And so, the title of the talk is Battle of Bunker Hill, the Folly of Hubris. It takes valor to succeed in battle. But a lot of these men were exhibiting excessive pride, hubris, and it came back to bite them. Some of the fates that these guys suffered didn't have to be that way. And so during this talk, we're going to meet the players involved, talk about the event, and a little bit of the aftermath of the Battle of Bunker Hill. So, in order to give it context is everything with this, we're going all the way back to the year 1630. We're not going to spend long in the 1600s. We've got to get all the way up to the 1700s, but go with me on this. This party animal is named John Winthrop. He was the leader of a group of people called the Puritans. They were leaving England. They were facing the beginnings of religious persecution, and so they decided to leave the Church of England, leave the continent, of Europe, and start off in a new home, a new world, a new place, so that they alone had the right to persecute every other religion besides themselves. So John Winthrop shows up with this gang of people, and Puritans, they were really only afraid of one thing. And that is that someone, somewhere, was having a good time. So they show up with their Bibles and their frowns, and they try to settle here at first. Now this is Charlestown. And you'll see it's a peninsula, only one way on land, on and off. And later on, this became a little man-made causeway. But for the purposes of, the Puritans and Winthrop, this was where they tried to settle. The trouble with Charlestown is that the water was too salty. The groundwater was brackish. And so it wasn't, they weren't able to sustain a community there. But here was this other peninsula just across a very little bay. And this was known by the natives as Shawmut, the natives being the Massachusetts tribe. That's why our state is called Massachusetts. You take off the S and you have the name of the tribe of people who lived not only in this area, but the Blue Hills were sort of a ceremonial ground for them, all over the place. 1625, a different British guy named William Blackstone shows up. And he started off in a settlement that is today Weymouth, Massachusetts. Back then it was called Wessagusset, and it was a failed settlement. The weather was too cold, they couldn't make anything grow, and as soon as those people from Old England got a look at New England, they got right back in those boats and went back to Old England again. But William Blackstone, was some sort of a masochist. He decided to stay, and so he made his way up, and he found Shawmut Peninsula, and he asked the Massachusetts if he could live there. And they said, sure, we don't live here. We use it for fishing when the weather is right. But yeah, if you want to build a little whatever, that's fine. So Blackstone was living alone, 1625 to 1630. The Puritans show up here. Their community is about to fail. They don't really have another option. They need to make this work. And so John Winthrop, the leader of the Puritans, sees tendrils of smoke coming off of this peninsula from time to time, and so he goes to investigate, and lo and behold, there is a guy he went to college with back in England. William Blackstone and John Winthrop already knew each other, and you can imagine the two of them in the 1630, what are ye doing here? Oh, well, what are ye doing here? Oh, coincidence. Okay, so it's decided that the Puritans are going to live on Shawmut because Shawmut loosely translates to living water. There was the Charles River on one side, the Boston Harbor, salt water on the other side, and in the center, fresh drinking springs. So living water was the wonderful place to, have a community. Well, the Puritans got over there, and the first thing they did was they got rid of the barbarous name Shawmut, and they named it Boston, because that's the town they had come from in England, Boston, England, which still exists even today. Okay. What followed for the next 124 years was something called salutary neglect. And the upshot is, England said, yes, Puritans, you can leave and you can never come back if that's your pleasure. It's our pleasure too, because we're not wild about you. But you can call yourselves British when trading with other nations, and you are expected to trade with Great Britain more than the other countries. However, there's a catch. We're not sending anyone to protect you. You're on your own. There's no army, so you have to start forming your own local militia. Okay, great. So the Puritans, make relationships with the Massachusetts, not great ones. William Blackstone was more of a pacifist than the Puritans were, but okay, they start a community. They start clearing fields for farming. They build towns, they build cities, they build commerce. They build trading relationships, not only with native tribes, but also with, other countries, and they have all of this going very, very well. 120-ish years later, 24 years later, it's a global conflict called the 7 Years' War. And locally, in this area, it was known as the French and Indian War, because this new continent, as far as the Europeans were concerned, was rich in lumber, fur, you name it, the agricultural possibilities. They wanted to strip it for everything it was worth. And so England already had, a foothold here. France had territory up in Canada. But now it became these two old global superpowers ratcheting up the tension with each other. And so locally, the British Army was sent from England to here to fight against the French and the natives. And just a side note, you got to feel bad for the natives trying to pick a side in this. They want everybody to leave, but now they're trying to choose between the French and the British, and it didn't work out for anybody ultimately. But at the end of all of this, the British win the French and Indian War, and so they retain control of the 13 colonies, and it came at great financial cost. And so England was in trouble because we were not their only colonies. This was a global empire. The sun never set, and that's a lot of upkeep. So all of a sudden they're looking at their war coffers and they're going, what are we going to do now? We've really spent a lot of money gaining this. And so they start finding ways to tax us. Little tariffs here and there, a duty, a tariff, a tax. Well, we had grown so accustomed, around Boston especially, to ruling ourselves and not having any interference by the British that we did not want to pay taxes to a European country. We thought of ourselves as on our own. And so we started saying, no, I'm not going to pay this tax, I'm not going to pay that tax. And I will say, as much of as they were sort of rabble-rousers, here's a different look at Shamit just as a placeholder. So, though they were rabble-rousers, the colonists here did have a point. They said, we already spilled our blood with you, and now you want our money. We fought side by side with your soldiers. That should be enough, because a lot of us died doing it. So don't start, taxing us on paper and wax and tea. It's absurd. So the way British society was structured back then, there was the king or the queen, the royalty, and then all the gentry, the nobility, the lords and ladies and dukes and earls, and then the common folk. But that wasn't the bottom of the barrel, because a lot of times the common folk turned into the mob. And I'm not talking about organized crime. I'm talking about a Latin term, mobile vulgus, I think is my best approximation of the word. But basically, what it means is, when there are not legal channels to protest something, you just grab a torch and a pitchfork and you storm down into the town square and you riot until change is affected. And in Boston, sometimes there would be British officials who were trying to enforce, a law by day, and then in a very flimsy disguise with the mob at night, trying to overturn the very thing because they knew how unpopular it was. So the mob mentality started to fuel the political sensibilities of Boston. And so here's an example of the mob in action. Now this is something that sounds very quaint. Tarring and feathering. Ha ha ha, how whimsical. No, this was torture. The tar was scalding hot, and somebody would get second, third degree burns all over their body when they were doused in this stuff. And then in order for an extra measure of humiliation, there would be feathers thrown on them. So this is entitled The Bostonians Paying the Excise Man. So they were not into taxes at all. This poor gentleman was named Thomas Hutchinson, and he was the royal governor at the time, and he was universally hated by the British and the Americans alike. He was described as a man whose arrogance, ambition, power, and wealth made him one of the most unpopular men in Massachusetts. And so in protest of the Stamp Act, which dictated that every piece of paper needed to have a royal stamp on it, so playing cards, postage stamps, newspapers, legal documents, everything needed that seal, and that seal needed to be paid for. So it's not just postage stamps, it is the stamp of paper. Bostonians freaked out to the point where they tore Hutchinson's house apart with their bare hands in the middle of the night. The mob had arrived, they started pulling the shutters off, then they broke the windows, then they pulled the doorknobs off, then they were in the house. They started taking the shingles off the roof, they took all of the booze, they took the books, they took the money, they took the clothes, they took the furniture. They were taking the molding off of the walls, and the only thing that stopped this mob was that the sun came up. And they didn't want to be individually recognized, and some of them had to be at work. And so they said, okay, good day, and they all split. And this mob eventually became, this was not a spontaneous thing, the way modern, when you have a riot in a city, it's just spur of the moment. They were so organized that eventually they refused to protest or riot on Sundays, because that is the Lord's Day. But every other day was fair game. So Thomas Hutchinson, he gets yanked out of Boston because he's not doing it anymore. Later on, 1770, I'll tell you the story before I show the image. So the British soldiers were stationed in Boston at this point, and there was a captain of the guards, just standing there in front of the government building, which was known then as the Town House. Today it's called the Old State House. Beautiful building with the lion and the unicorn at the top of it. Well, he was just shivering there on a cold night in March, trying to get through his sentry duty, and this local teenager shows up and starts yelling at him, saying, hey, I work for the wig maker, you didn't pay for your wig, and my boss is mad at you. And the soldier's like, go away, kid, will you just leave me alone? Well, one thing leads to another, and the soldier ends up hitting this kid with the butt of his musket. the kid leaves, goes right to the tavern across the street where his older brother has been for hours with all his friends, and so they're feeling pretty mighty, and they all come out and they start surrounding this one soldier. Luckily for this soldier, other reinforcements have arrived. They're walking down the street, so now there's 9 British redcoats total, but now everyone in the street is gathering around because it's a mob, and they love it. It's late at night, and it's cold, and they're drunk, and what better to do than harass the British soldiers who legally are not allowed to fire at you. It's a glitch in the law back in those days, so the redcoats had their hands tied every minute. Okay. As this tension is ramping up and the crowd starts throwing things at these soldiers like rocks and firewood and oyster shells to cut their skin on the way by, a fire breaks out somewhere nearby and all the church bells start ringing, which was the signal for a fire. So in the middle of all this madness and chaos, these British soldiers start hearing everyone in the crowd yell, "Fire, fire, fire, fire," and they misunderstand. They think it's an order. They lower their muskets and they fire into the crowd. The British people call this the incident on King Street. Samuel Adams and his buddy Paul Revere, who made this etching as a printing plate, called it the Boston Massacre. And they started spreading their version of this story all the way through the colonies, all the way back to Europe. So 3 years later, King George is an investor in the East India Tea Company. They've got warehouses full of tea, and it's getting eaten by bugs, and it's drying out. And this huge financial investment that King George and other investors have made is about to be wasted. And so they go, we got to move this product. Let's offer the colonies an exclusive deal. We will sell it for pennies on the pound, but we're going to put just a small tax on it to try to regain the money from the war coffers. This British tea, even with the tax, was far cheaper than anything that the Bostonians were already buying, especially the smuggled tea that was brought in by John Hancock, the richest guy in town. He was, a revolutionary, but in terms of finances, he was Daddy Warbucks, he was Mr. Potter, he was Bill Gates. He was the richest guy you could imagine, and a lot of his proceeds were ill-gained, like Dutch tea that he was smuggling in. Okay, so we ask, please take the tea back, we're not paying any tax. They say, no, you're going to pay the tax on the tea, you're going to unload the ships. We say, please, we beg you, take the tea back, we don't want any problems. They say no. Samuel Adams is leading a meeting at the Old South Meeting House, and he says something to the effect of, well, I see there's nothing more this meeting can do to save the country. And that was the secret signal for about 150 young men and boys disguised as Mohawk natives from New York to go to the harbor and throw every single crate of tea overboard into the sea, and that's the Boston Tea Party. Luckily for the revolutionary cause, King George flipped out. His overreaction to the Boston Tea Party was so outsized that all of a sudden people on the fence about, should we revolt? I don't know. It's not so bad being British. I like them. All of a sudden, the port of Boston is closed. This has been an international shipping and trading hub since the 1600s. And now all of a sudden, no ships, no boats, no barges, no nothing are allowed into this harbor except British military boats. And if they see a boat in there, they're going to shoot at it until they sink it. Port is closed. Economy crashes. The other thing they did is they disbanded all local government, meaning we couldn't vote for our own representation anymore. And so every position of authority was appointed in England, sent to Boston, and there they were expected to rule. And the Quartering Act meant that whether you were a British loyalist or whether you were not, you were expected to house British officers in your home, feed them, make repairs to their clothing. If there weren't enough beds for them to have one, you got out and you let the soldiers sleep in it, the Quartering Act. So you have a bunch of angry, disenfranchised, broke people hosting their enemies. To say that this was a simmering cauldron about to blow up is an understatement. So, enter Thomas Gage. This guy had it made. He was a rising star in the British military. He was living in New York with his gorgeous wife, Margaret Kemble Gage. And he was in parties of high society all the time. And at one point, he was actually in the presence of George III. And he overheard George complaining about, oh, these wild Bostonians, and what is wrong with these people? Why can't they just obey the simple rules? And Thomas Gage, kind of, feeling his rank, says, "My lord, if you were just to make a show of force, I think the Bostonians would lay down like dogs." And George says, "You're hired." And Gage is like, "What?" So all of a sudden, he is plucked out of New York and sent to Boston, where he is not only the chief commander of every single British troop on the continent of North America, including Canada. It's a big pile of paperwork, but he's also the royally appointed governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So he is expected to do double duty. He's supposed to do all the governing and enforce the laws at the same time. Well, we got a real problem with Margaret Kemble because she is American born and she loves her family. And so her loyalties are toward them. But she's a good wife, and her loyalties are also toward her husband. And she is ultimately a Brit, so her loyalties are to the crown. And she was so conflicted during her husband's, placement as this royal British governor that she wrote to her friend, and she was quoting a Shakespeare play called King John. And I won't do it now, but the upshot is she was saying, "Whichever side wins, I lose. I am stuck completely in the middle here." And so Gage, you have to wonder over time how the degradation of his relationship with his beautiful wife started to play on his psyche and affect the decisions that he was making moving forward. So Gage keeps saying to the Parliament and to the king, "If you want me to actually solve this problem, I underestimated the will of these people. I need more men, and I need more money." They refuse to be placated, especially in the country towns. And he is quoted as saying, "If you think 10,000 men sufficient, send 20. If you think 1 million pounds sterling is enough, give 2. You will save both blood and treasure in the end. A large force will terrify and engage many to join you. A middling one will encourage resistance and gain no friends." Now, Joseph Warren. Has anyone heard of Joseph Warren? Okay, so a few of you have. Most people have not, which is a real shame, but we'll get to why that happened. Joseph Warren was a kid who grew up on an apple farm. His father was owned an orchard, and Joseph helped, and his brothers helped, and all of that. And Joseph Warren was a teenager when his father fell out of an apple tree and died almost right away, broken neck. It was a horrible tragedy, but they were such a big deal in the community that the community rallied around and took up a collection to send Joseph to the college. There was only one. Harvard. He went to Harvard, and he studied medicine. And he did pretty well. For a low-born kid, he graduated like number 2 in the class, which the way Harvard worked at that point, it was all about social hierarchy and how much money your family had. And they did rankings of the first student on down based on assets and societal value. So Joseph Warren didn't have any money. I mean, his community was paying for his college, but his intellect was such and his personality was such that he rose right through the ranks to be among the highest in society in that little bubble. So as he graduates from school, there's a huge smallpox outbreak. And all of the established doctors in town are too scared to go into homes and to go into the community to treat people on site. But Joseph Warren is a young college grad, and he's going to make a name for himself. And so he starts treating rich people, poor people, young people, old people, amazingly successfully. He helps a lot of people overcome smallpox. Of course, he doesn't cure it, but he helps with the discomfort, and he becomes known as a trustworthy man of the people. As he starts getting older, he also starts developing political opinions. And for instance, government should give every man the greatest liberty to do what he pleases, consistent with restraining him from doing injury to another. Sounds reasonable to Americans, sounds very dangerous to the British Parliament and to King George. So, Joseph Warren is a man on the scene, and General Gage is ordered by the British Empire to do something about these Bostonians. And so Gage comes up with this plan, because while the British soldiers are in town, people are stealing muskets from them all the time. People are carrying off cannons from under the noses of the British sentries. They go to sleep, the sun sets and the cannons are there, and the sun rises in the morning and the cannons are gone, and the British sentries didn't hear a thing, and Gage is, now putting more things in the paperwork. Well, we lost another cannon, and he's humiliated, and the pressure is on, and so he needs, in football they call it the Hail Mary pass, just a desperate move. He has spy intelligence that tells him that the stolen cannon and a lot of barrels of gunpowder and other provisions that have been pilfered from the British in Boston are being stored in Concord, Massachusetts. And he knows it's true, his sources are trustworthy, so he decides he's going to have a secret mission where they send 700 British redcoats in the middle of the night from Boston to Concord. Joseph Warren also has his own spy intelligence network, and he hears rumblings that the British soldiers are gathering a large force and moving to the west. He doesn't know about Concord, but what he fears is that they're going to Lexington, the town next door to Concord, because John Hancock and Samuel Adams, I call them at this point public enemy number one and public enemy number one. There was no two. These guys were wanted for treason because of their organization of the Boston Tea Party. King George had orders for them to be arrested, shipped back to England, and hanged there for treason. Joseph Warren knew that John Hancock and Sam Adams were hiding out in the home of Jonas Clark, a minister, and so he dispatched people he knew he could trust, Paul Revere and William Dawes. So we know Paul Revere. We don't need to get into him. But William Dawes, I just want to tell you how William Dawes came to the attention of Dr. Warren, because this guy gets short shrift all the time. Dawes had been concerned in the successful plot to steal from under the eyes of a guard the cannon belonging to the artillery company. In lifting the cannon, he had silently to endure the pain of having his cuff button embedded in his wrist. When the wound troubled him, he went to Warren to have it dressed. When his refusal to tell how he had been injured was as good an explanation to the keen doctor as any, Dawes was therefore just the man for Warren's needs and served him well at such a time. So, Dawes knew that he could tell Warren what he had done, but he didn't, and Warren was like, ah. So, okay, these two guys are dispatched, and they go, one if by land, two if by sea. Well, William Dawes took the land route off of Shawmut Peninsula, and Paul Revere lived in the North End. This is about where North Church would be today, and he got rowed in a boat, which was risky because the port was closed. There were no other boats to disguise him, so he was rowed under the guns of the HMS Somerset on the line where the ferry used to go from Boston to Charlestown. Oh, sorry, there's Charlestown. And he gallops off into infamy. They get to Lexington. They warn Hancock and Adams of the danger. Then they get to Concord, and where the weapons had been, but they had already been hidden like 3 days prior. They were brought to other towns, Ayr, Haverhill. I mean, just it's so easy to deceive the British Army because there were so many people involved in this subterfuge. But one of my favorite stories of Concord is as the British soldiers are marching in, they're at like the Old Manse, right near the North Bridge, and there is a farmer plowing the field and making those even rows. There were lines of muskets in the rows of the field, and the British soldiers were like 30 yards away and thought nothing of this guy plowing a field in April. I mean, it was so close. Anyway, so the British soldiers march into Lexington. The militia is there, shots are fired. The militia was outnumbered 100 to 1, and 10 to 1. Still, they stood, they paid with their lives. A couple hours later, the British troops enter Concord. Now, this street is Main Street in Concord. It still exists. This tavern, Wright Tavern, is still there. This graveyard, the Hill Burial Ground, is still there. You can walk right up it and have almost this exact view of the town. And these two guys, Pitcairn and Smith, these are the British officers who were in charge of this secret mission, and boy, did they botch it. And these two are sitting there. Smith has the spyglass, and he's looking toward the North Bridge. And at the North Bridge, local militia is there. The British soldiers are trying to cross the bridge to get to Barrett's farm, where the weapons were supposed to be. The local militia misunderstands. They think that the British are burning down the town because there is a bonfire. They're throwing like wagon wheels into it. One thing leads to another. They meet at the bridge. Shots are fired. So the British soldiers have to go all the way back to Boston now, on the same exact road they took out here. So the Minuteman National Park is Battle Road. They took the same route. It was the shortest and quickest route. But the difference is, at night, there was nobody shooting at them. From the moment Paul Revere and William Dawes started waking up house by house, all of the militiamen they knew they could trust, it was like this amazing, it was like lighting the fuse of a bomb. And so everybody, this guy woke up his two neighbors. These two neighbors woke up two more. And it became hundreds and thousands of local militia walking to get to Lexington. Then they said, no, they're in Concord, but they're coming back here. Let's make it Battle Road. And so the British soldiers suffered heavy, heavy casualties all the way back they got to Charlestown. Then eventually they were able to, lick their wounds a bit and then make it back to Shawmut. But the local militia, never stopped arriving. The word kept spreading, and people walked from New Hampshire. They walked from Connecticut. And over time, this thing grew and grew and grew. And it became known as the Siege of Boston. Now, I want to make one point here. You know the way Paul Revere and Sam Adams controlled the narrative of the Boston Massacre? We did the same exact thing with Lexington and Concord. It was vital to us that we controlled what England and Europe thought of this event, because it's very easy from the British perspective to say, we had official soldiers going out on official business and these local maniacs opened fire at us, so we had no choice but to retaliate. But what we did is we spun it around and said, there we were minding our own business, not doing one thing wrong, and all of a sudden this occupying force marched into our villages and shot us dead in our streets. And they put their account of this in a ship called the Quero. The Quero was a merchant ship that normally was laden with goods, and to get across the Atlantic Ocean was a costly, dangerous affair. So you would always fill it as much as you could to maximize the risk and the profit at the other side. But the Quero was empty, except for this scroll, because we needed it to get there fast. And we beat the British official account of this incident by 2 weeks. By the time General Gage's official record showed up on the shores of London, the Parliament was already up in arms. King George III was furious. And so Gage's esteem falls even further than it already was. And the ministers and the king see him as cautious and weak, and the rebels call him a monster, and he's lost the confidence of his own soldiers locally in Boston. So rather than sending more soldiers and more money, even before Lexington and Concord happened, the Parliament and King George had already given up on Gage. And so rather than sending more troops, they sent more generals. Just what you need, more guys with opinions. So they came across on a ship called the Cerberus. And in mythology, the Cerberus is the name of the three-headed dog that guards the gates to hell. And this was such a wonderful happening in British culture that somebody wrote this poem about it. It said, "Behold the Cerberus, the Atlantic plow, her precious cargo, Burgoyne, Clinton, Howe, bow, wow, wow." So these three on the Cerberus make their way into Boston Harbor, and they encounter another British Navy ship, and they have these talking horns. There's no amplification, so they're doo-doo-doo, hello, what news? You wouldn't believe it. Guys, welcome to the port of Boston. About a month ago, there was gunfire in Lexington and gunfire in Concord, and now there are 10,000 militiamen surrounding Shawmut Peninsula, and we are trapped. There is a siege going on. And so, hold on, I want to make sure I do this right. Okay, so that happens. And so I will pause that story just for a moment because I want to introduce these generals. General Henry Clinton, this guy was just a real stick in the mud. He was a brilliant military mind, and he was such a difficult personality that nobody cared that he was smart. He was described as colorless, short, rather paunchy little man with a round face, a large nose, and a sensitivity to criticism that was almost a disease. Although he was an intelligent, reasonably competent soldier who might have gone far, his tendency to suspect everyone, to look behind every remark and gesture for an affront, made him mistrust even himself in the end. Then we have General Howe, William Howe. William Howe was a handsome man, about 6 feet tall, with dark hair, black eyes, and a majestic reticence that did not prevent him from having a very good time when not on the battlefield. This guy was a gambler, he was a bit of a drinker, and he was a rebel sympathizer. Not that he was in cahoots with them, but whereas other generals and officers were so angry at these treasonous, locals, Howe just kind of threw his hands in the air and thought of them as like teenagers. He's like, oh, these colonists. So he was, as cavalier as he was with his attitudes personally, he was a valiant soldier, and no one ever criticized or questioned his bravery on the battlefield, and that comes into play later on. But the most colorful of them to me is General John Burgoyne. So I paused that story when they go, doo-doo-doo, we're trapped on the peninsula. And so Burgoyne was a playwright. And he is a big back-slapping great time of a guy, and everybody loves being with General John Burgoyne. And he says, what? 10,000 peasants keep 5,000 king's troops shut up? Well, let us get in, and we'll soon find some elbow room. Oh, his ship goes crazy. The other ship goes crazy. They start talking with their little talkie horns, and by the time this ship, the Cerberus, gets to Long Wharf, where the Marriott Hotel is, that's where they were. Everybody in the crowd is waving and crying in relief that finally they're going to have, the loyalists in town, not the locals. The loyalists are, oh, the generals, the Cerberus, elbow room. And they are met by a gilded carriage like Cinderella would drive in, and they come up Long Wharf, and they finally visit Thomas Gage. Like he's going to be so thrilled, and he's just sitting there like, hello, gentlemen. Let me show you around the place. Okay, so Burgoyne, Clinton, Howe, and now Gage have to come up with a plan. And so Joseph Warren, the doctor, writes a letter to General Gage addressing him as an equal, which really rubs Gage the wrong way. This is a citizen. This is not anybody appointed by the military. But he's addressing him as an equal, and he invites him to negotiate because it's getting awkward. The British are trapped on Shawmut Peninsula. And he wants to negotiate to save lives, more or less. Gage has the playwright John Burgoyne write an official response. And in this official response, he is offering to pardon everyone except John Hancock and Sam Adams. They need to go back. We have to hang them. And it was flowery, and it was flamboyant, and it was widely ridiculed. This letter was too much. A gilded lily, right? And so the patriots, our side, we'll call them patriots, counter with another offer to pardon all of the British soldiers and all of the British officers except General Gage and the guys who keep trying to collect the local taxes. Well, so negotiations are off, not happening. Now, while Joseph Warren is extending the olive branch with one hand, he is writing inflammatory calls to arms with the other hand, and he's calling the British barbarous murderers, the barbarous murders committed on our innocent brethren, all of these events. And he is quoted as saying, it's a call to arms, "We conjure you by all that is dear, by all that is sacred, that you give all assistance possible in forming an army. Our all is at stake." There was another British lord after Lexington and Concord who took a moment and he said, "Whoever looks upon them as an irregular mob will find himself much mistaken. Upon the alarm being given, they come from far and near, and the longer the action lasts, the greater their numbers grow." One of the guys who heard about Lexington and Concord like a day later, maybe not even that long, Israel Putnam. He lived in Connecticut. There's now Putnam County in Connecticut. You can see his birthplace and all of that. This guy was a veteran of the French and Indian War, and he had fought shoulder to shoulder with soldiers for the British Crown. He knew all of their military strategies and their tactics, and he was plowing his field, and a message comes that there has been actual gunfire in Lexington and Concord. He leaves the plow in the dirt. He didn't even unhook the cattle. I guess somebody else did. He runs in, gets his riding gear, gets his horse, and gets every single sheep on his property and drives this herd of sheep directly to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Harvard University is on one little part of the town, and then just across there's something called Cambridge Common. It's just a big park. That is where the rebel headquarters was located. So the brain trust of the 10,000 militiamen was at Cambridge Common. Israel Putnam shows up with all of these sheep, and he says, "Maybe you've not heard of me. Let me tell you some of my resume." And Israel Putnam is a man of action. This guy, when he was a British soldier, he was shipwrecked with a whole bunch of other soldiers, and the ship was falling apart, and he had started instructing people to take this beam and that beam and lash them together, and they made rafts, and then they were floating to Cuba, and then they had a survival party while they were trying to not get eaten by the cannibalistic locals. I don't know if that was true, but Putnam convinced everybody else that was true, so they survived that. He also is credited as killing the last she-wolf in Connecticut. So he climbed into a cave with a rope tied around his ankle, and he had a torch and a sword, and he said, "Oh, I'm sick of these things eating my sheep. I'm going to kill the last one, and when I holler, pull me out." And that's what happened. He went into this den, he stabbed the wolf, he hollered, they pulled him out. Oh, they're carrying him around on the shoulders. He's a great guy. He also, as a soldier, saw that an ammunition store, like a huge barn of gunpowder, was about to go up in flames because there was a fire nearby, and he ran toward it instead of away, and he organized a bucket brigade, and he was the head guy closest to the fire, and this went on, and he was so badly burned that for years it took. He was still recovering, but he saved that ammunition. So this guy is one of the dudes that shows up. So you picture him with General John Burgoyne, the playwright. I mean, these are not evenly matched people. So, all right. Oh, so Putnam. Oh, one more thing. Oh, it's Putnam. So everybody's very bored. The British Army is bored. They're stuck in this little peninsula. The 10,000 militia are bored. They're like, well, we walked here from New Hampshire. We thought this was going to be more exciting, And so just to keep busy, they're marching around in formation. And Putnam would love to march his soldiers in full view of Shawmut. Hello, we're waiting for you. And so out in Boston Harbor now, there aren't as many islands as there used to be. Logan Airport is a big landmass. That used to be several islands. And one of the islands was, I think this one is Hogs Island or Noddles, doesn't matter. What matters is they all started stealing things from the islands. The British soldiers would go over and cut down all the hay so the colonists couldn't feed their cattle. And so they go, oh, they stole the hay from that island? Well, I have an idea. Let's go to this other island. And so the colonists would go, and they would steal all the cattle off of this island so the army didn't have anything to eat. And they're arguing and fighting and stealing. It's so juvenile, but it's rather entertaining. And then one day, this ship, the Diana, the HMS Diana, had very valuable military cargo on it. And so the admiral of the British fleet, Graves, earmarked his own son to be the captain of the Diana. And so it's making its way through the islands, and they decide that they're going to, get off and start harassing cattle or hay or something like that. And Putnam sees this, and so he starts marching down toward the water, and he's yelling at them, and they're yelling at him, and next thing you know, the British are starting to fire at Putnam. Putnam had offered them the chance to surrender, and what they offered back was cannon fire at Putnam. So now they're shooting at each other, and in wasting all of this time being silly with each other, the tide shifts, and the Diana gets grounded in the soft sand, and it can't move. And now the tide is going out. And so the Diana has cannons, but as the ship tilts, all of a sudden, the cannons can either shoot straight up in the air or straight into the water. And Putnam and all of his buddies get into boats, and they start rowing out and yelling, and they're about to attack the Diana, and all the sailors are like, oh dear! And so they all run away, and the colonists capture the Diana. They steal all of this valuable military intel and instruments from the boat. They burn it, and they take one of the masts, and they turn it into a liberty pole on their headquarters in Cambridge. The British are mortified by this. So this is Israel Putnam. All right. There's another guy. Okay, this is just a placeholder image. I'll tell you this story because there's another guy I want to introduce. But I'll introduce him this way. You know how you talk politics with your family and it's always a good time? Oh, yeah. There was a loyalist named Abijah Willard. And he was a staunch loyalist, and he had this brother-in-law that just was so uncivilized. And he kept talking about things like revolution, and it was just so crass. And Abijah Willard said to his brother-in-law, your life and estate will be forfeited for treason if you take up arms against Great Britain. And the guy he's talking to is named William Prescott. And William Prescott says, I've made up my mind on that subject. I think it probable that I may be found in arms, but they will never take me alive. So that is Prescott. Joseph Warren and the Committee of Safety find out that in order to break this siege, the British have formed a plan to bust out of the siege, casualties be damned, they're doing it. And they're going to row from Shawmut over to Cambridge, the shores of Cambridge, and they're going to march to Cambridge Common and rout the enemy, us, the Americans. And that's supposed to happen on June 18th. We come up with a plan. We're like, we can't let this happen. We don't have the might to fight them on that peninsula. Let's distract them. So we come up with a plan to fortify one of the high grounds. They were arguing about, should we fortify Dorchester Heights? That would be good, but it's kind of remote. It's kind of steep. I don't know if we can really get there without incurring too much risk. What if we fortify Bunker Hill in Charlestown? That's high ground, and that will distract them. They'll be so distraught that we've gotten this high ground, they will abandon the plan to come attack us in Cambridge. Okay, so 1,000 militia are organized. They have shovels, pickaxes, they have some muskets, some ammo, and they are under the command of Israel Putnam, the hothead, and William Prescott, who is not afraid to be found in arms against the British Army. They go up into the middle of the night. They start digging. They start digging. They're digging all night. General Henry Clinton, the guy that nobody likes, he can't sleep because he knows nobody likes him, right? So he's out for a walk in the middle of the night, and he's walking along the shore, and he can hear pickaxes and shovels and men yelling and all of this crazy stuff going on. He can't see what's happening, but he can hear it, and he knows enough to know when a fort is being dug, right? So he goes immediately to General Gage. It's the middle of the night. They didn't start until midnight, this digging party. He goes to General Gage at like 3 in the morning and says, I hear that the rebels are, building works over in Charlestown. And Gage was so frozen with indecision that he says, oh, let's just wait till morning and we'll figure out what to do. So that's what they do. So these guys have all these extra hours all of a sudden. Rather than the troops, getting in boats to come over and when the fort's half built, they are digging and digging and digging and digging. So the sun rises. Guys are exhausted. They don't have enough food. They didn't bring enough water. They've been digging for hours. It's 6:30, 7 a.m., whatever the sun rises in April or June at that time. And they look around, and all of a sudden they realize they're on the wrong hill. Bunker's Hill, named for the Bunker family that let their cattle graze there, is here. Boston is way over here. This is the north end of Boston, like Copp's Hill Burial Ground. Bunker's Hill is far from this little spit of harbor. This is Mystic River, which is tidal, so it's not reliable for ships. This is the harbor, but even so, the height of Bunker's Hill is such that no ship can really scale their cannon up that high. So this was intended to be a chess move. Either by accident, because they weren't locals, or by design, because Israel Putnam was always looking for trouble, they dig into Breed's Hill, which is lower and closer, not only to all the ships in the harbor, but also to the Copp's Hill Burial Ground, where there is a cannon. It's called, at that point, the North End Battery, and they've got cannons there. And at first, when the Admiral Graves put a cannon in the North Hill Burial Ground on land, all of these military people were like, he should stay in his lane. What's an admiral doing putting a cannon on the land? Well, nobody was laughing now, because guess what? The rebels have dug in within cannon range of the North End Battery. And so Graves is like, I told you. Anyway, so the HMS Lively, a British ship, begins firing at the redoubt. And this is the sound that wakes up most of Boston. John Quincy Adams was a little kid at this time. Abigail Adams was on their farm in Quincy. And he said years later he remembers the windows rattling with the sound of this cannon at daybreak. And so all of these guys in the redoubt are like, wait a minute, I said I would dig, and then I was going to be relieved by other people. I did not expect, first of all, to be on this hill, and second of all, to be shot at with cannons. And so William Prescott is among the men, and he's going, they are trying to scare you, and look, it's working. They can't hit us. They're way in the water. Their cannons can't get high enough, this, that, and the other thing. So in the middle of Prescott, reassuring these guys that everything's fine, a cannonball from the Lively, boom! You know when you skip a rock on water? This thing starts skipping uphill on the land. And a guy named Asa Pollard takes his head off. His body is there, his head is gone, and everybody around him starts looking for clergy. They want to have a proper funeral. Prescott, who's a veteran of the French and Indian War, goes, you have shovels in your hand. Bury him now before anybody else sees this. We'll pray later. Dig now. so they bury him, and in order to spur on the men to courage, William Prescott gets up on the wall of the thing, the parapet, and he is got his hat in one hand and a sword in the other, and he's almost dancing, twirling his sword around, yelling at the British ships, "Hit me if you can, hit me, I'm target, hit me." At this point, General Gage finally wakes up, gets dressed, and, it is dawn, I'll grant him that, but he gets to the North End Battery, and he's looking at through a spyglass, and he sees just this chaos, and he sees this guy dancing around on the parapet. And he has this loyalist next to him, and he hands him the spyglass, and he goes, "Do you know who that is on the parapet?" And the guy takes the spyglass, and he goes, "It's my brother-in-law." The guy with the spyglass was Abijah Willard, and there is William Prescott, "Hit me!" So he's made his decision. He's taken up arms against the British, right? So Gage asks him a question. He says, "Will he fight?" Which I love as a question, because already they're there with guns, but it's like, how much fight is he going to give, right? So, will he fight? I'm going to pause, because there are two answers in very credible books to this question. The question is, will he fight? And one very credible author says, "Yes, sir, he's an old soldier and will fight as long as a drop of blood remains in his veins." Great, right? But then you read another book and it says, "Will he fight?" And the answer is, "I cannot answer for his men, but Prescott will fight you to the gates of hell." Ah! So how do these very credible, careful authors end up coming up with two different, responses? After much digging, I figured it out. The first one about drop of blood in the veins, that was according to William Prescott's son, talking about his dad. The gates of hell one is the grandson. So you can picture how many times in the family this story has been told, and it's growing and growing, and now he's got no blood in his veins at the gates of hell. So anyway, so it's this funny moment when Gage realizes who he's up against. So, all right. Prescott, at this point, finally gives the orders to get the reserves. There's like 1,000 guys in the redoubt who have dug it all night, but there are 10,000, there's like 9,000 other guys in Cambridge available. Some of them are on Bunker's Hill, which is visible. You can see them just standing there, leaning on their muskets. And so Prescott says, it's time to go get the guys. Israel Putnam, for some weird reason, says, no, first we have to get rid of all the shovels and pickaxes. In case this doesn't go our way, I don't want the British getting them. So let's get 200 guys and take all the shovels and digging equipment. And Prescott's going, if we let them out, they're not going to come back. And Israel Putnam goes, on my honor, they will. Well, they didn't. So these guys take all the shovels, all the pickaxes, and go. And then no reserves start coming. So they've taken their number from 1,000 to between 700 and 800 just for these dumb digging tools. Prescott decides to send, because Bunker Hill guys are not coming, but he goes, there are so many thousands in Cambridge, we just need to get word to them. So he sends this, soldier, and he says, go borrow a horse from the artillery and ride to Cambridge Common and tell them that we need reinforcements. So this guy walks up to the artillery commander and says, I need a horse. He says, no. Okay. So the soldier doesn't have any authority, so he goes, so sorry. And he walks to Cambridge. It takes forever. And by the time he finally gets there, he's met with, this is Prescott on the parapet, dancing around. This image comes back later on, so it's an iconic image of him. So he walks, this poor guy, what's his name? John Brooks. He walked from Charlestown all the way to Cambridge, and then he meets with Artemus Ward, wah, wah. This guy, honorable, diligent, slow, methodical, cautious. And this is the first he's hearing now that they dug in on the wrong hill. He's like, I'm sorry, what? And that they're firing cannons, and why don't you send us all your guys? And Artemis Ward is like, first of all, that's a lovely invitation, but I don't think I'm going to take you up on that, because what if this is just a ruse? The British are firing at our, mistaken redoubt, but really they're still gearing up to attack us in Cambridge. I can't give you all the soldiers you want. So in the middle of this sort of arguing going back and forth, there's a guy named Devens who decides that all New Hampshire men who are in Cambridge are going to report to Breed's Hill and fight. Okay, so they, without Artemis Ward's permission, they go. Now, meanwhile, Joseph Warren, the leader of this whole scene, is nowhere to be found. There had been reports of him having a migraine the day prior. He was noticeably absent. It was not in his character to be absent. And so he wasn't there. People were starting to get concerned about this. And meanwhile, back at the parapet, the artilleryman Samuel Gridley Locks is what separates now Boston Harbor from the Charles River. That's named for Richard Gridley. He designed the fort, and he was providing the artillery. And the guys who built the fort hadn't put any holes for the cannons in the walls of the fort. And all their shovels and pickaxes had been sent away by Israel Putnam. So Gridley's in there with cannons, and they start trying to dig with their hands, and it's not working out. So luckily Gridley says, hey, look, we don't have enough gunpowder for a whole fight, but we certainly can do this. And he pushes the cannon up against the wall and lights it, and blows a hole in the thing so that now the cannons can do their work from the top of the hill. Great. So now the artilleryman, Gridley sort of, leaves. He's commanding other things. And the artillerymen in the fort start lining up, and they got something in sight. They've got a ship. They're going to shoot this cannon. They light it. They go, and this cannonball misses the ship, misses the water, misses the north end. And John Burgoyne, the playwright, is at the North End Battery, and he sees this cannonball go 100 feet over his own head and hit a house in a different neighborhood. The next shot wasn't any better. The next shot wasn't any better. These guys cannot hit a thing, and so after like 5 cannon rounds, they run away. That's why they wouldn't give the dude the horse. They were planning all along, if they couldn't shoot straight, they were going to run away, and that's exactly what they did. And later on, when Israel Putnam caught up with them, they were court-martialed for cowardice after the fact, because what they did was abandon the people who needed them the most. So, 12 p.m., Putnam tells Prescott that he's just going to ride around the fort and get as many men up there as he can. And this is when the first British transport begins rowing from, not the north end, but over near Long Wharf, Rose Wharf, that area. They start getting into boats. And I'm going to read you, this book is fantastic. You can see I enjoy this book. This is called Decisive Day by Richard Ketchum. And I'm going to read you his words about this event. And here's some visual accompaniment. Before them was a sight the like of which no one had seen before, and whether they had an hour or 50 years of life remaining to them, it was something they would remember until they died. Even seasoned British officers, men who had seen the great armies of Europe line up before an attack, admitted they had never witnessed a scene such as this. Across the third of a mile of water that lay between Charlestown and Boston came the barges, 28 of them. 2 parallel lines of 14 boats in single file, loaded to the gunwales with scarlet-coated British soldiers. Here was all the pageantry and color and drama of war in the 18th century manner, the face of battle that caught at men's hearts and made them see it as beautiful and majestic and terrible all at once. The long white oars swept back and forth across the blue water in carefully ordered cadence, bringing the barges closer every river closer to the waiting rebels. In each of the 2 leading boats were 6 bright brass field pieces. Behind them came the flower of the British Army, nearly 50 men to a barge, massed at attention. The glistening steel of their guns and bayonets made 1,000 points of light. The sun glinted from polished brass and gleaming white, and the riot of blue and red and gold and white was reflected again and again in the shimmering water. Finally, Joseph Warren comes onto the scene. He's sorry that he's late. He's in his finest clothes. I mean, like, exquisite. It would be like showing up in a 3-piece tuxedo to a battlefield. He's got a borrowed musket. And the first person he engages is Israel Putnam. Now, Joseph Warren had been made a major general by the Provincial Congress, not because of his military acumen, he had none, but because of his influence, his dedication to the cause, and his ability to rally a crowd. And so this was not uncommon for a guy with no military experience to become a general, but he was a major general. He outranked everyone there. So he says to Israel Putnam, "Hi, sorry I'm late." Putnam says, "General, I cede command to you. What shall we do?" And Warren says, "Oh, no. I'm not a soldier. I will get everybody killed. And besides, the paperwork hasn't officially arrived. I'm here to fight with you. You don't fight for me. I will fight with you. Where should I go?" So Putnam says, "Okay, well, Prescott is up in that dirt thing up there, and it's going to get ugly. Why don't you go there?" Okay, so Warren goes up the hill, and he sees William Prescott. William Prescott says, "General, what shall we do?" Same thing again. Warren says, "No, I fight under you. Tell me what to do. I want to be where the action is hottest." So everyone who's seeing him is like, "Joseph Warren, like, what are you doing here? You're the president of the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts. Go home. You're the center of the rebel spy network. Go home. You're an active member of the Committee of Safety. You're a doctor. You're a father to 4 kids. Go home." And Warren will not go. He sees this as his calling. So he says it'll be a privilege to fight under Prescott, and he grabs his musket and he joins the line. So the British finally arrive on Charlestown Peninsula, and the first thing they do, eat lunch. They build some fires, they heat up their stew, and they eat lunch on Morton's Hill. And the guys in the redoubt are like, "Oh, what are they doing? What? Oh my God." And so they realize we have more time. So they're still digging and digging and digging. And now the New Hampshire guys who had come from Cambridge, Knowlton and Stark primarily are the 2 commanders. They decide that they're going to start fortifying this rail fence. It's like a stockade fence. They start stuffing it with dirt and rocks and hay, whatever they can find. It's not sturdy, but it's something to hide behind. Here are Stark and Knowlton. They also dug these V-shaped trenches called fletches in the hill. All this stuff to slow them down. Now, I want to show you this map. The original plan was to go with ships around the Mystic River this way and have foot soldiers land and come through this town this way and do a pincer move to hit the fort from both sides. But because of the delaying that Gage had engaged in, waiting for daylight, now they're eating lunch, this plan goes awry because there are snipers in the buildings of Charlestown. Patriot snipers. And so when the soldiers try to go through, they're getting shot at. And then this was awful. They sent foot soldiers around here to Mystic Beach, but this is where the rail fence is being built, and there's a stone wall. They decide to extend the stone wall down to the beach. And when the column of British soldiers comes around, I won't get into detail, but I read one account that says they were cut to ribbons. So right away, this, you can see, all the casualties here. There's nowhere to go. They can't go in the water. They've built this fence. They've got stone walls. So the water route is no good. And the tide has now changed, and Admiral Graves doesn't like losing ships in the shifting tide, so he's unwilling to send gunboats up the Mystic River in case they get stuck. So the town is not an option. The beach is not an option, and they realize it's got to be a frontal assault straight up the hill. General Burgoyne, I love making fun of him, but wait till you hear his account of this. One of the greatest scenes of war that can be conceived. Howe, General Howe, Howe's corps ascending the hill in the face of the entrenchments. And in the arm of the sea, our ships and floating batteries cannonading them. Straight before us, a large and noble town in one great blaze. The church steeples were great pyramids of fire above the rest. Behind us, the church steeples covered with spectators. The hills round the country covered with spectators. The enemy all in anxious suspense. The roar of the cannon, the mortars and musketry, the crash of churches, ships upon the stocks, and whole streets falling together. And the reflection that perhaps a defeat was a final loss to the British Empire in America. So General Howe is the guy who was going up. And I told you he's a drinker and a gambler and a Patriot sympathizer, but he was never criticized for valor in battle. And as he's turning to his soldiers and saying, we're going straight up the hill, he says to them, I will not go a step further than where, I will not ask you to go a step further than where I go myself at your head. And he was true to that word. He was the front of the column, and they start marching up, marching up. Oops. Here they are going up the hill. You can see the casualties piling up. They just keep coming. This is the way the British Army fights. They're going up, going up, going up. Now, one of the quotes that's attributed to this battle all the time is, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes. Nobody can prove or disprove if that was said there, but one thing that was definitely said was aim low and aim for the best dressed. Because the best dressed were the officers. And if you shoot an officer with one musket ball, two guys have to carry him off the field. You've got 3-for-1 casualties here. So Prescott knew about how far a musket could fire accurately, and so before this advance, he went out and drove rods into the ground that all of his soldiers could see. And he said, do not fire until they pass within these rods. And so the British come up, they have their first volley, and the soldiers are just decimated. Bodies everywhere. They run away. They reorganize themselves. A lot of their officers are down, but they get into the command of new officers real quick, and they start walking up again in formation, bayonets, backpacks on, blankets. I mean, they're going on like a camping excursion. They've got all this stuff on them, 180, 100-pound backpacks marching in columns and rows. And the second volley, boom, cut to ribbons again. And there's this weird moment where General Howe, in the front of the line, sees next to him the guy, his attendant, who's carrying a bottle of wine, per tradition. The musket ball goes through the bottle of wine and straight into his aide's heart, and the guy dies, and the wine is spilled everywhere, and there's bodies around him everywhere, and Howe himself is completely unscathed. And he's just looking up the hill, and Prescott sees him, and he says to the people right around him, don't shoot that one. There's something else going on here, something cosmic. If that didn't kill him, don't pick him off now. And in his writings, General Howe describes this as a feeling that I've never felt before. So this is one of those moments where he just was taking it all in. Now, here are the Patriots in the redoubt. You can see a depiction of Prescott, all the men waiting. So after the second volley and the second horrible casualties of the British, the soldiers are begging Howe not to go again. Please, no, we can't get up there. We can't. But Howe is resolute, and he knows that if they blow it in Charlestown, they might as well kiss the continent goodbye. So he's going, no, a line has been drawn in the sand. We're going back up. Take off your backpacks. Ditch everything you don't need to carry. Don't even load. Point your muskets down, get those bayonets out, and run up that hill. No columns, no rows. As fast as you can, scream as loudly as you can. We want to terrify these guys. And so the third charge is the British doing exactly that. And what they did not know, but what Here's a depiction of the charge. What the Patriots in the fort knew is that they were running out of ammunition. They had shot everything they had. They didn't expect to be the ones fighting. They were supposed to have reinforcements and supplies. But these 700 or so people are starting to look around for nails, pebbles, rocks, anything they can stick into that musket as a projectile. Prescott, the British are overtaking the fort. Oh, here's the rail fence, more action at the rail fence. It's just chaos and carnage. The British soldiers, because the rebels are without ammunition, they're able to breach this fort. And they're stabbing, and the smoke from the fire. The reason Charlestown is burning down is because the cannons from the ships they were flaming incendiary cannonballs to burn the town down to get rid of the snipers. So you've got all this acrid cannon smoke, all this musket smoke, black powder smoke everywhere. The churches are falling in the streets. All of this acrid smoke you couldn't see, you couldn't hear. It was complete chaos. And Prescott sees these British coming over, and he refused to turn around to run. He had his sword, and he was parrying bayonet thrusts by all of these redcoats. And when he finally made it out of there, his hat had a hole in it, his coat had a hole in it, his pants. He had escaped within an inch of his life over and over and over, parrying these sword thrusts, bayonet thrusts. Here's another depiction of the chaos inside there. Now, after the fact, a merchant writing to his brother in Scotland said that they found out that the musket balls were poisoned. The ones that the rebels were shooting at them, they were poisoned, and they were intentionally shooting leg shots because they knew that the people would live long enough to get back to the peninsula and get in the head of all of the remaining soldiers and all of the loyalists. It was psychological warfare that they were engaging in. And there was a loyalist girl who was one of the little girls on the church steeples in Boston watching this unfold. And she wrote later, she said, "I have read many times of the glory of war, but this one battle taught me, however it be painted by poet or novelist, there is nothing but woe and sorrow and shame to be found in the reality." 2,200 British redcoats went up that hill, and only 1,100 of them made it off. 700 American soldiers up there, roughly 1/3 of the casualties. So better for our side, I guess, but it's all just awful. And the soldiers, the British Army lost more officers in that one battle than they lost for the entire rest of the Revolutionary War, which sowed chaos for the rest of the war. They had under-trained officers in charge of all of these people. Now, after the fact, Henry Clinton, the guy no one likes, he says it's a dear-bought victory. Another such would have ruined us. General Howe says the success is too dearly bought. General Gage, his official report was, they were not the despicable rabble they were supposed to be. This poor guy, right? And in a private letter, he says, the loss we have sustained is greater than we can bear. I wish this cursed place was burned. Boston ruined his life. Now, Joseph Warren fell at the Battle of Bunker Hill. This is a painting by John Trumbull. He was a general, but he was also a painter. And here is Joseph Warren, the center of the piece, and you can see a bayonet thrust about to happen, and a guy parrying the bayonet thrust, asking for reason and civility. This is an artistic rendition of the actual death, but it was a huge, huge loss to the Patriot side, to the point where they almost called the whole thing off, really. Without their leader, Joseph Warren, they didn't have, they were without a compass. And prior to this, like 2.5 months prior to this day, Joseph Warren was in the Old South Meeting House speaking in a toga for pageantry at the anniversary of the Boston Massacre. And he said to them, on the subject of revolt and the new country, If these pacific measures are ineffectual, and it appears that the only way to safety is through fields of blood, I know you would not turn your faces from your foes, but will undauntedly press forward until tyranny is trodden underfoot, and you have fixed your adored goddess Liberty on the American throne. Our country is in danger, but not to be despaired of. Our enemies are numerous and powerful, but we have many friends determining to be free, and heaven and earth will aid the resolution. On you depends the fortunes of America. You are to decide the important question on which rest the happiness and liberty of millions yet unborn. Act worthy of yourselves. And so the way Joseph Warren actually went down, it wasn't that beautiful, pietà. He was facing his foe, ushering every other person out of the one door in the redoubt as the acrid smoke overtook them, and he got shot right in the face and fell. And the last he was seen, he was rallying his men, shot, facing his enemy in a field of blood. Had he only known how prescient those words were just 2 months prior. General Howe couldn't believe that Warren had fought or that he had died. He expressed disbelief that a man of his political stature would have fought. He said this victim was worth 500 of their men. Joseph Warren's eulogy included a man whose memory will be endeared to his countrymen and the worthy in every part and age of the world, so long as virtue and valor shall be esteemed among mankind. Gage's reputation, General Gage, people who hated him said, let him alone to the hell of his own conscience and the infamy which must inevitably attend him. But people who liked Gage said he was a good and wise man surrounded by difficulties. General Howe resigned in a storm of criticism for his decisions leading up to the defeat of John Burgoyne in Saratoga. Burgoyne was forced to surrender in Saratoga, and somehow William Howe got blamed for that. I understand why, but anyway, he resigns. Clinton, he continued to chafe fellow generals and officers, even in British victories. He successfully did bring Charleston under siege, and then he left command to General Cornwallis. Cornwallis lost at Yorktown, and Clinton got blamed for it. So this poor guy, he couldn't catch a break at all. And General Burgoyne, Saratoga, he is forced to surrender. He's expecting reinforcements, a supply chain. It doesn't happen. He surrenders his sword to Horatio Gates, and he's taken as a prisoner, and he's brought all the way back to Boston, Massachusetts. And there's a ship waiting at the end of Long Wharf where the Cerberus had delivered John Burgoyne. And there are crowds gathering just to get a look at Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne once again. And as he's being led there in shackles to the prison ship, an old lady climbs on top of a shed and goes, "Look out, here comes General Johnny. Give him some elbow room." Boom. So, after the war was a disaster. And one of the reasons people think it happened that way is because of what happened on Bunker Hill. There's a wonderful writer named Dr. Alan French, and he says, there are various critical stages in the American Revolution at which the proper action of these three men could have destroyed the Patriot Army and wrecked the rebel cause. This gentleman, Richard Ketchum, says, that each man failed at one or more crucial moments has led some writers to conclude that the battle for Bunker Hill left an indelible mark upon all three, the memory of those grisly slopes affecting their decisions ever afterward. Now, 1825, speed ahead a bit, they've decided they're going to build a monument to this thing. 1825, the guest of honor is a gentleman named Marie-Joseph-Paul-Yves Roche-Gilbert de Montier, better known as the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette is now an aged veteran, and he's on a victory tour of the new country that he helped to establish. And he was asked to be the guest of honor, laying the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill. And he was so moved by the proceedings that he asked his attendants to dig up trunks of dirt from this battlefield so that he could be buried in it in Paris upon his death. And they did that. And so when he passed away, He is buried now in Picpus Cemetery in Paris, and one of the people who put the dirt on him was his own son. And an American flag always flies over the grave of Lafayette. I'm sorry. It always gets me worked up. His devotion to the cause and the country was never in question, and it goes on to this day in ceremony. So today, this is Bunker Hill, Breed's Hill, really. Bunker Hill is still, you can see it, but it's not where the battle happened. And there's a monument. It's a glorious monument. 1825, they began it. You can climb to the top. They're actually restoring it right now. So if you see it, it's got scaffolding all over it. And you can't even see out the windows at the top. So don't climb yet. Wait till you can see. But this statue in front is William Prescott in his moment that General Gage saw him through the spyglass, proving that he wasn't afraid to fight. So to wrap up, the hubris of these people, the commonality that they all share, even though they were born in different places and had different roles in this, the ramp up to this, had Burgoyne's pardon letter not been so obnoxious, maybe the rebels would have sort of laid down arms. Had he not been so arrogant with elbow room, maybe the people in the militia would have, calmed down a little bit. But the idea that they were just going to swashbuckle their way through civilians, not cool. His entire personality symbolized hubris. Putnam pulling the men out of the redoubt to put shovels away because on his honor they're going to come back. Hubris. They didn't come back. Gage waiting till daybreak to engage because, the British Army will probably take care of it. We take care of everything. No! Fight now! Joseph Warren refusing to leave the battlefield. He shouldn't have shown up to begin with, but he wouldn't take no for an answer, and he died in that moment in his hubris. And so that is why I call this the folly of hubris. King George's overreaction to the port of Boston, the Tea Party, he was personally injured, and so he really let the Bostonians have it. And all of that animus just ramped up the pressure cooker that was, the inevitable, which is Bunker Hill. So it's been 248 years since June 17th, 1775. And I love this quirk. The easiest way to remember June 17th, the battle date, is it's Boston's area code, 617. And I've been trying to find out if that's by design or by serendipity. I will let you know when I find out. But either way, it's awesome, right? So 617, you just know, it's June 17th. 248 years ago, that battle was fought. But as I said at the beginning, if you walk through Charlestown, you can just feel the old world energy. And you can see, monuments to these people. Down in the square, like Main Street Park, there are plaques that have the names of the people from each state, each militia, each commander. It's just such a moving experience on our home turf to be able to go and pay tribute to the bravery of this accidental battle that shaped the rest of the war. And so thank you so much for letting me tell you about this. If you have questions, I'll take them. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you about your background.
The question is just asking about my background. I was so excited to begin the talk, I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. So my name is Johnny Kinsman, and I was trained as an actor from the time I was a little kid through a present day. It's never a thing you stop training for. But, so that's where my interest in public speaking comes from. But 15 years ago, I needed a job, as actors do, and I ended up getting a job with Boston Duck Tours. And so I grew up in Concord and couldn't have cared less about the North Bridge. Oh, so boring. Henry David Thoreau. Dumb teenager. And so all of a sudden, years later, I end up getting this job, and they said, you got to drive this thing, and you're a boat captain. Oh, and also you have to be an expert on the local history. Here, read this. And all of a sudden, in the context of learning about the whole city, I started learning about, all the Lexington, the Concord, and Bunker Hill and everything. And so it just really, I got my tour route down, I got the information in my head. But that was like sowing a field for, further planting. Once I got, a little taste of what the 18th century in Boston, I've just never looked back, and I keep reading everything I can and coming up with different lectures about, Paul Revere's Ride and Battle Road and the rest. So I'm not a professional historian, but I am an enthusiast. Yes?
So I'm confused. General Knox in his canon. What is he? I thought he was involved in this.
No. General Henry Knox. Oh, I love that. I'll try to make this short, but God, I love this. So General Knox was a guy who sold books in Boston. That was his trade. And he wasn't a military guy, but because he was working in this bookstore, British officers would come in and order books about military strategy and artillery and all of this. And so he would order these books, and every time they would arrive in the shop, he would read them cover to cover before he let the people know that they could pick them up. So he became a self-taught military artillery expert. So Bunker Hill happens, Joseph Warren dies. Now, just to underscore Joseph Warren, I forgot to say this in the talk, it was speculated that had Joseph Warren continued on his political trajectory, George Washington would have been an obscurity in history. The loss of this guy was unbelievable. So Washington shows up like 3 weeks after the Battle of Bunker Hill. And the militia is still there, but Warren is gone, they have no real leadership, and what a rabble he encounters. And so he's trying to create an army out of this group of 10,000 maniacs, maybe that's where the band got its name, and up comes Henry Knox to him and says, listen, I don't have any actual experience, but I've read 97 books on artillery, and I've got an idea, because the siege of Boston was still going on. This battle didn't break the siege. The British were still trapped on the peninsula. They had gained Charlestown, but even that was meaningless because of Cambridge Common and because of, they were at a stalemate. So when Washington arrived in Cambridge, he went to, in Boston, he went to Cambridge, took command of them, and Henry Knox said, I have a way to break the siege. We know that Charlestown isn't going to work. We tried that, and now the British have command of it. But remember, Dorchester Heights is still up for grabs. And Fort Ticonderoga in New York was abandoned by the British forces during the French and Indian War. Once we won, we just left everything there in case we need it again. So General Knox said, he wasn't a general yet, he was just Henry. Henry Knox says to Washington, if you give me men and an allowance, I will get those cannons from Ticonderoga and I will bring them here in 3 weeks. It took him more like 2-3 months, but it was in the middle of the winter. He took all these people up to Ticonderoga. They got the cannons. It was like hundreds of thousands of pounds of brass cannons, and there was so much snow that they couldn't use wagons with wheels. They ended up refitting them as sleds, and they hired locals everywhere they went, and they brought them all this way. They lost 2 of them when they were going across a lake. The ice broke and the cannon sunk to the bottom. And rather than just leaving it there, Henry Knox organized people and they got them out. I don't know how you do that, but he did. And then he brought these things over the Berkshire Mountains and showed up in Boston with them. And George Washington was thrilled to have them, obviously. They set up Dorchester Heights, and they had some cannon, but not enough. And so what they were also doing is they were felling trees and painting them to look like cannons and putting them at the correct angle. And they had set up these, I think of them as like hunting blinds, so that the British couldn't see what was happening. They knew something was going on, but they didn't know what was happening. And every once in a while, the militia would come over to Charlestown and fire a cannon off to distract the British. It was all of this, chaos. And then finally on March, I think it was, around March 17th, because that's when they finally left, they decided to drop those hunting blinds. And the British commanders and the Navy, they looked up into Dorchester Heights and they saw cannon, 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 tree trunk, cannon, tree trunk, cannon. But it all looked like cannons to them. And they realized that Not only could the Patriots blow the city apart if they wanted to, they could also get every single ship in the harbor if they wanted to. And so they tried to engage. The British decided, okay, we'll make a landing in Dorchester. We're going to climb up. We took them off of Bunker Hill. We're going to do it again in Dorchester. And they get in their boats, and a tempest happens. It's like a hurricane. These guys are getting swirled around like it's a toilet bowl in Boston Harbor, and they finally make land, and they're trying to crawl up, and the guys at the top are throwing these barrels of spikes at the... It was horrible. And finally, the British were like, I think we're gonna leave. That's enough. And so... Evacuation Day in Boston is the same day as St. Patrick's Day. It's a coincidence, but it's celebrated every year. The parking meters are still free because General Howe, who was at that point in command, and General Washington made a gentleman's agreement. And the agreement was, if you promise not to fire your cannons at our ships as we're leaving, we promise not to burn this entire city to the ground on the way out. And they both agreed, and they both kept their word. And the irony of all of this is that they barely had one barrel of gunpowder. They had cannons, but they couldn't have shot at the British if they wanted to. That's part of the reason for the trees. So anyway, that's Henry Knox, and later on he became a major player in the rest of the war. And his house is a museum now up in Maine. It's called I forget. Anyway, I'll think of it on the drive home. Anyone else? No? Oh, yes.
I'm listening to this lady here, not what I meant, but we used to call it, of course, as a little girl in Boston, we had, the Suffolk County had that day off from school, big holiday, evacuation day.
Yeah.
Eventually, I left to in the western part of the state, Long Meadow, Springfield. What day is it? Your kids didn't go to school? Only that county that we lived.
Yeah. Evacuation Day is a big deal locally. Yeah.
I remember I was growing up in Boston and in Brooklyn. I would celebrate that.
It's cool, and you don't realize that it's a local thing until you travel, and they go, "What?" Yes, sir.
Where was George Washington during the Battle of Bunker Hill?
A good question. He said, where was George Washington during the Battle of Bunker Hill? I don't know exactly, but I would suspect he was still in Congress, either in Congress down in Philadelphia, sorting out the paperwork about becoming the general, or he had already been, given the job, and he was preparing to ride up to Boston because he knew that once he got here, he had to take command and that he wasn't going back to his home anytime soon. But like I say, he was just weeks away from coming, and who knows, if he had arrived before all of this happened, who knows if this battle ever would have taken place. So he was just late, which I'm sure he was fine with. Yes?
One other thing, I have walked that, being, quite a native, whatever, I've walked it, and there's a great mill pond when that was being built, marvelous book by, his name, Martin. William Martin.
Oh, yeah.
That day, William Martin.
Yep.
I've read it 10 times, and every time I read it, I glean something from it. Do me a favor, if you can, on
Yeah.
this map, I know it's an old map from archives, I can picture Boston Neck, which we know as Washington Street. That is correct. All right, now you come to an intersection. I am assuming that which goes into Brookline is probably the continuation. Is that I know that going off to your right.
This way.
All right, no. Go off to your right, the major road to you. No, your right.
My right.
Yeah, that
My
way.
left.
Yeah, that way.
That way.
I'm assuming that's Mass. It seems to be going out to what we call Dorchester Heights, Columbia Point.
Yes.
Et cetera. What is that road? Go back down that road. That way. No. Go back to the little white square. Yeah. Yeah. Now go more. I guess you're going into Roxbury. What is that? That's still Mass Ave? Do you know?
I don't know.
I'm trying to.
I'm sorry. I don't know. I knew it. Well, I was giggling because I knew I wasn't going to know the answer. But you're right. This is Washington Street, and it's the longest street in the state still. But I don't know. So Dorchester is here. Yeah, I think that It stands to reason that this is Mass Ave. I'm getting my bearings here. So if this is Dorchester Heights, this is all now landfill. This is sort of where Castle Island is. And so Mass Ave does extend into Dorchester proper. That's where the Ducks park at night. So we drive on Mass Ave all the way, down to the Prue, which is like, well.
But it stops at Columbia and then it goes up
Yeah.
and the beaches and everything. I know it.
Yeah, I don't know specifically what it's called, but I'll look into it if you like. Yes, sir.
It's one of the ironies or coincidences associated with evacuation day. This takes place in March 1776, but it's not until July 4th. The revolution properly starts in most of the U.S. Boston, it's over. It's done.
Right, that's true.
The barricade outside the apartment
Yeah, but to your point, once the British evacuated Boston, we were done. I mean, we were sending soldiers on campaigns, but there was not another action locally ever since. And the harbor was open, and everything was back to normal, and so for people, you're right. Most of the country understands July 4th as the beginning of it, and all of this stuff is just sort of preamble, parenthetical nonsense. Oh yeah, didn't a bunch of stuff happen in Boston? But in fact, this was the formative, cauldron that launched the rest of the revolution. Yes?
So I just have one interesting fact in Framingham. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Right near where Framingham State is, up on the hill. General Knox, and it said that he passed through that spot on the way to Boston from Taiwan.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah, I haven't seen it, but I'll look for it now. How every inn, every bed and breakfast, Washington slept here. Well, now there's also sort of that thing about Lafayette, when he did his victory tour. But Knox, that whole thing, that operation was called the Noble Train of Artillery. And so the Framingham marker is one of the stops on the Noble Train of Artillery. And so if you follow along, you'll find hundreds of spots that are saying, they slept here, they ate here, they did this here.
That was definitely his route. He basically came down Route 9. If you think about it, it's Route 9, western part of the state. It's definitely down Route 9, the hills of Worcester, up and down Worcester.
Gotcha.
And as soon as you come down Route 9, we know it now, that it comes into Huntington Ave. You hook the right.
Okay.
Mass Ave, and that brings you to the top of the Dorchester Heights.
Gotcha. I mean, can you imagine? It's tiring to drive to these places. Can you imagine walking in the winter and pulling thousands of pounds of... like when you said Route 9, I'm like, oh, I got a headache on Route 9. Imagine... Anyway. I see Sarah's giving me the signal here.
I was just going to add that you mentioned Knox's house in Maine.
Oh, yeah.
So it's the Knox Museum. It's called Montpelier.
Montpelier!
It's in Thomaston.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Montpelier. I always get it confused with Monticello and Mount Vernon. I knew it's an M. And that, at the beginning, I said my 6-year-old has had it with me reading things. It's because I took them to Montpelier. We were on vacation in Maine. I said, you kids are going to love this. And oh my God, they hated it. They hated it, every minute of it. They were like sleeping. And I'm like, look, this is a piece of the USS Constitution. And they're like, Daddy, we hate you. But yes, thank you. Thank you. I love being here. Thank you very much. Thank you.